Hey there, Empowered Tribe. It's Angela T. Moore. You're getting ready to experience the 20th episode of Empowered, a health and wellness podcast where I share my personal journey of health and healing, tips for mental and physical health, interviews with health and wellness experts and those bold enough and vulnerable enough to share their own journeys to empower you to succeed in yours. We know that life can be rewarding. It can also be challenging. It has its ups and downs, highs and lows. I learned that with a strong mind and a fit body, you are better able to grow through and grow from whatever life throws your way. My goal is to share journeys of health and wellness, as well as tips and information from extraordinary people all around the world to help you live an empowered life. My guest, Demarra West, author of Me Too, Therapist's Journey to Heal, Find Liberation and Joy, became a therapist more than a decade ago. Although she knew that her attraction to therapy was rooted in the traumatic childhood she had, she was convinced that was in the past and never really saw that she too had immense healing to do. She turned to holistic healing practices to support her work with Be Well Beautiful Woman, a global wellness company dedicated to helping all women heal and liberate, especially those most in need. Now she lives a full, vibrant life on a mind, body, spirit level and is tapping into the birth-giving joy, peace, and prosperity we are all meant to experience. In this episode, Demarra talks openly and passionately about her personal journey to heal, find liberation, and joy. Demarra shares key moments in her journey where she recognized that the remnants of her past were negatively impacted her present, and that in order to continue to move powerfully into the next chapter of her life, she was going to have to do the work. Now, after doing the work and healing along the way, Demarra is on a mission to help other survivors of trauma heal, find liberation, and joy. I hope you enjoy the episode. Demarra, you became a therapist more than a decade ago, and like many therapists, your attraction to therapy was rooted in your traumatic childhood. Recently, you openly shared that even though you were convinced that the impact of your childhood was in your past, you realized that you had, I quote, some immense healing to do. How did you come to that realization?
Yeah, this is a really powerful question. I knew that my childhood was riddled with pain. You know, I grew up in poverty. I later discovered that I had 8 out of 10 what's known as adverse childhood experiences. And what all I knew, though, was that I wanted to raise my daughter differently than how I was raised. And I also knew that I didn't want to be in poverty, right? So I was literally just putting one foot in front of the other and doing a lot of things externally to make my life better from a financial standpoint and doing good in the world in terms of serving my community. And I also knew that becoming a therapist was very much rooted in this lived experience of having pain, but I didn't have a name for it. And I got married, I became a mother, an entrepreneur, a licensed therapist, a certified coach, a board member for the YWCA Kalamazoo. And it was about 6 years ago, in part because I started to center holistic practices when I founded Be Well Beautiful Woman, which is a global wellness company that focuses on helping women to center their healing and liberation so that they can lead and live on their own terms. And so when I started seeking these practices, these holistic practices like yoga and breath work and Reiki, it was really as a result to be in service of other people. But when we're in pursuit, right, of healing others, we oftentimes find that we actually have some healing to do ourselves. And there was some unfortunate and fortunate things that happened resulting in me getting a divorce and from a beautiful human. Let me be really clear about this. But this recognition that we had really grown apart, essentially. And we started off somewhat on the same planet. And then by the end of 15 years of marriage, just realizing that we weren't actually evolving at the same pace. And as I describe in my book, light speed ahead, right? But a lot of that light speed ahead work was external versus this recognition that I had internal work to do. So as I started to immerse myself in these holistic practices, a lot of things started to come to the surface for me. And it allowed me to face very, very dark parts of myself that I didn't even know were present, right? Things like I had been overweight for years. And in fact, I'm still overweight. And I'm working with a personal trainer right now because I said this is going to be the year that I actually get this weight off for good. But in part, that was a manifestation of my trauma. Being like working myself to the bone was a manifestation of my trauma. And because I was trying to prove something unconsciously to the world that I was worthy, because I had been told on many occasions that I wasn't worthy, in part because, as a teenager, my trauma manifested in behavioral issues. And I talk about this explicitly in my book and the aftermath of having 8 ASAs. And that was hard, right? But when I worked through that, by about the time that I was 18 and I started to come out of that, I met my ex-husband at 19, and then I was married at 22, and then I had my daughter at 24. And in the midst of that, I started my business and I was in grad school. So a lot of my time was spent on like being in service of others and trying to curate a life that was far removed from the life of my childhood. And so that's how I started to discover there were a lot of my remnants of my trauma at play. And that if I wanted to live a liberated life, which is what I want for all of us, then it meant that I really needed to take a step back and center my healing. And I've done that through so many practices that I'm sure that we'll talk about at some point today.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said service to others. Do you think that you recognize that in addition to being service to others, you need to be in service to yourself?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think this, and this is not a new idea, right? That we put the oxygen mask on for ourselves first. But if you would ask me, 8 years ago, I would have told you my oxygen mask is on, right? Because I had no level of awareness about the way that my trauma was playing out, and that, because whatever we don't face, we can't heal. And so in my mind, because I'm moving forward and my life on the surface is far removed from that, it never even occurred to me, right? I mean, I spent 3 years in grad school. I was a school-based, home-based therapist. I'm working with people with trauma. But in my mind, I really felt that was the past and I could leave it behind. And I think this is the fallacy that so many people that have similar stories to mine are faced with, right? Mm-hmm. Like we believe that if we get the education and we get the job and we get the title and we move in the right neighborhood and we do all of these external things, that we don't have to do the work on ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so that's really been more of the recent inspiration of my work, to help us all to understand how us too have been impacted, knowing that trauma affects 70% of the US population. We have at least one traumatic episode in our life. Now, of course, when you're talking about someone like me and many people, across the globe, some people have more trauma than others, right? Which means that there's probably more healing that we have to do than others. And so for a long time, the way that I facilitated my healing and my well-being was going on vacation and maybe doing a yoga class every now and again, or doing a hike every now and again. And now my practices are very deep. I have, when I start my day with Reiki or meditation every morning before I get out of bed, right? That is a practice that helps me connect to self, helps me connect to spirit, and a myriad of other things that I do, starting my day with these practices so that I can make sure that I'm facilitating my healing first, because healing is like an onion, right? We don't arrive at it. I talk about this in my book. There are certain wounds that are so deep that we will carry those wounds with us until the day that we die. Mm-hmm. But our job, our opportunity, I should say, is to face it so that the triggers associated with that trauma is not in the driver's seat of our lives, right? Mm-hmm. And understanding the ways in which our bodies have been hijacked by trauma, because many people don't realize that trauma affects every single major organ system in the body, essentially.
Most
It
definitely.
affects our ability to focus. In fact, many young people that have been diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, what research shows is that it's actually trauma. And so when you think about that, right, if your child has been given a diagnosis of ADD and ADHD, and you begin to medicate them, they can't actually get well from that place because we're not dealing with the root cause. And so, I really want to be able to normalize trauma and how we are affected by it and the ways in which we can heal it, right? Including predominantly through self-healing practices. And so I focus a lot in my work on sustainable healing, right? And that, we don't have to wait on anyone to heal us. God, universe, source, creator has given us so many tools to heal our own bodies.
Yeah, I want to talk about your book because you recently published your book, which you have in the back, which I love. Me Too, A Therapist's Journey to Heal, Find Liberation and Joy, which I understand is part memoir and part self-help book. What can you tell me about your book?
Yeah. So first I'll say that this book is 26 years in the making. And the book that I released in December is very different than the book that I released when I first completed a manuscript for National Writers Month. And in part because I'm different, right? I had not gone on this very deep healing journey. And writing from a place of being more whole is very different from writing from a place of victimization, right? And so as a person that has been impacted by trauma, I'm a victim, but I'm also a survivor, right? And so being able to write stories in the most humane way possible, understanding that the individuals who harmed me were also harmed in some way, right? Yeah. And so I write about my eight adverse childhood experiences and the traumatic events that were most pervasive for me, right? That I have the most memory of and that still affect me to this day. And then I talk about the ways that I was affected by trauma, right? And so there's a question that we ask if we're trauma informed, what happened to you versus what is wrong with you? And so I can't help but wonder if that question would have been asked about myself as a teenager who was at war with myself, which meant also that I was at war with the world. And which also meant that I was harming myself and I was harming many people in the process. I can't help but wonder how my life would have been different. So I named systems that could have done more, like the education system. I had a therapist that had literally written me off and told my mother that if she didn't get rid of me, that I was going to destroy our family. And the criminal justice system, when I sought justice for some of the individuals who harmed me in a very grave way. And then I talk about, coming out of that and beginning to put one foot in front of the other and all the things that I started with in the beginning about being married and becoming a mother and an entrepreneur and someone who was very service minded and a founder. I founded several initiatives. I just realized I've founded 4 initiatives over the course of my career, and that's all been in service to the world, essentially. And then this awakening that happened for me that was unfortunate and fortunate in that I walked away from the only life that I had known for 15 years with my then husband, who is now my ex-husband, and into a world that was very unfamiliar to me. It was, facing ourselves is not easy, but it's the most worthwhile work that we will ever do in this lifetime because we can rise from that place. We can find our purpose from that place. We can live a joyful life from that place, essentially. And then I talk about the practices that were really most central to my healing. And these practices are not just for survivors, they're for anyone. We're talking about the practice of honoring grief and forgiveness and having an abundant mindset, which are good for all of us if we want to live well while we're here on this planet.
I actually had the privilege of watching an interview that you did, I want to say on Fox 17, and you stated in that interview that many trauma victims are often just trying to put one foot in front of the other and try to make the most sense of their past and to live their best life. And I want to go back because you referenced the people that hurt you. And one of the things that you said in that interview that I thought was so key, you said that it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago that I realized that I had a lot of healing to do. What I love most about what you said, you continue to say, turning to holistic and indigenous practices to be able to write a story that was balanced to support the humanity of the individuals that harm me. Understand that those individuals are hurt individuals that have not had the opportunity to heal. Yeah. And I just thought that was so significant because I know that finding compassion for those that have harmed you can be difficult for many people. Yet I feel, and I have recognized in my own personal life, it's an essential part of your healing.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you reflected that back. And, my heart really felt that, right? Every time I think about the practices that have helped me see the full humanity in the people that harmed me, it's it makes me deeply emotional, right? Because forgiveness is a choice. And I write about this in my book that, many trauma advocates and survivors don't believe that they have to forgive in order to move on with their lives. And in many ways, we don't. However, what the research shows is that any form of unforgiveness that we hold actually harms us, right? And so it's not hokey or unrealistic to believe that forgiveness is a gift that we give to ourselves, right? First, to be free, but then to see the full humanity in other humans. I say often that in any prison cell across the world, these are trauma survivors, right? These are individuals that have had very horrible things happen to them, and some of which they carry so much shame around that they may not ever tell anyone about, right? And the remnants of their trauma facilitated crimes that harmed other people that ended up ripping them of their freedom, essentially, right? But imagine if we were to center holistic indigenous practices in preschool, right? Knowing that in places like Detroit, for example, that by the time a child is 5, 25% of those children have experienced at least one traumatic episode. And if we don't have anywhere to put the trauma, the pain from the trauma that we've experienced, which actually trauma recovery is not about healing the trauma, it's about regulating our nervous system, right? And if we can regulate our nervous system to get back to our natural design, which is to be joyful and to have abundance and to be loving, then we can get on with living purpose-filled lives, with living lives that are rooted in being in connection with other humans. Because as much as we want to believe that we don't need other people, our survival is actually based on our ability to be in connection with other people. Now, loving ourselves enough to be okay in our own solitude is really critical. But if we have been so harmed that our heart has closed and contracted to the point that we say, I don't need anyone and I'm not going to let anybody come in, and how dare these people, and the world is at war with me, like that's a pretty bleak way to live. And so I really believe that we forgive first for ourselves, right? So that we can go on living in whatever way that we decide. And then as we do that, we find that our compassion builds, right? Our compassion builds for self, and our compassion builds for the people that harmed us. Now, I certainly don't need some of these people in my life ever, right? I don't ever need to talk to these individuals again for me to have compassion for them and to understand what would have caused them to do this to me, even under the most seemingly unforgivable circumstances.
One of the things that I know has been very helpful to my clients and even for myself in my personal life has been able to forgive people for not being able to be the people that we needed them to be.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And I was just saying this to a client today that we can live in duality, right? Grieving what could have been and I'm getting emotional right now. And also giving ourselves the gift of forgiveness so that we can be present, so that we can see the gifts that are here right now. And I think so often, because we're grieving that little girl or that little boy or that non-gender specific individual, we can get so caught up in the past that we miss the present. And we miss all the ways that God, universe, source, creator, is supporting us in getting to where it is that we want to go in life. And so I do think that when there are moments that we're moved to deep sadness and grieving what could have been or the people that we wanted to show up for us and to care for us, and I think that we can sit in that, but the key is not to sit in it so long that we deprive ourselves from having a joyful life right now. And so often these deep emotions that are actually rooted in low vibrational emotions can keep people stuck for years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. You hear about division in families and people not talking to people and now sometimes we don't need to talk to people, but sometimes when you hear about what caused division in relationships, and it's like, really? You're not talking because of that? Because we don't know when our last breath is going to be, right? You and I could leave this interview and tomorrow it could be done. And my hope is that for all of us, that we can say that we lived fully, that we did our best with what we had, that we don't have anything left on the bucket list, or at least we've been working tenaciously to check off the things on our bucket list. Because as Mary Oliver said, we get one precious life. Mm-hmm. That's it. Yeah. Right? Even if we believe in the afterlife or we believe that we come back reincarnated in this body, we get this one time, right? And we can go on living or we can live less than, which I don't think is what is connected to our design. Maslow's hierarchy of needs, talks about like self-actualization. Many people live on this planet never getting close to that, right? And in part, they never get close to that because in order to get close to that, it means that we have to be dedicated to the self-discovery process. We have to be dedicated to living a life of truth, to facing the parts of ourselves that we don't want to face because it's painful to look at ourselves and to look at where we come from and to look at how what we've come from has also caused us to do some harm in our life, right? But if we don't do those things, not only are we going to have disease in the body, right? That is typically a manifestation of trauma. Trauma shows up in all kinds of ways in the body, right? And we're certainly not going to be able to live a life that is sustained when it comes to joy and peace and all of those higher level things that is available to all of us, and we're worthy of it simply because we're here. Mm-hmm. We may not know it yet, right? Because we have taken on lies in part that has been facilitated by our trauma.
Oh, definitely.
But when we get to the heart of the matter, what we will discover is that joy and peace and empowerment and love is right at our fingertips. But we've got to do the work to be able to access it.
And I think it's the work part that scares people. That truly scares people. Yes. Because when you've been wounded, broken down, told that you don't matter, told that you wrote off, I think that you, over time, develop this low opinion of yourself, this feeling that you don't have the ability to do powerful things in your life, that you are not a powerful individual. And I have learned that it's typically those people that have gone through the most trauma that have amazing strength, amazing resilience, and often have tools and techniques and methods that once activated can be utilized in their lives to allow them to live in powerful ways and achieve magnificent things. My fear and my concern is that, unlike you and I, who have been able to identify those tools and techniques and methods and those treasures that we have inside of us and that we have used to help ourselves and other people, that there are millions of people out there that will never discover that because they are still, they're stuck in that place of being wrote off, of being told that you are not worth anything, you are no value, and that people should give up on you.
Yeah, that resonates so much. And that's really why I had to write the book. It's, certainly started with the calling for me to write my story. And I didn't know what it would end up looking like. I didn't know when I would get to the end of the journey. And I certainly didn't know that it was going to call me to do more trauma-informed and trauma advocacy work for the very reason that you just said. And I wrote it for survivors, but I also wrote it for people that have the privilege of supporting survivors. And that's all of us. We're talking about family members and friends and the systems that I named, because trauma itself is not what is harmful in isolation. It's actually what happens afterwards. Because if a survivor is actively trying to get help, and if there is psychological safety in the help that they seek, then they can begin the healing journey, right? And if we can begin the healing journey expeditiously, then we reduce the impact that trauma can have, because whatever doesn't become released, it literally becomes stored on a cellular level in the body, right? And so if people can, whether it's my book or, but the body keeps the score, or work with a trauma-informed coach or therapist or someone who is trained in EMDR and other kinds of holistic modalities, they too can get the kind of healing that you and I have been able to receive, right? But you said it, many people don't want to look at that part of themselves. I was doing an interview for a trauma and healing podcast series that I'm getting ready to release centered around the book. And I was interviewing Dr. Gail Parker, and she said, the neural pathways that communicate with the brain when we're in physical pain are the same neural pathways when we're in emotional pain. And so when you think about that, when we're in physical pain, typically we're going to do all we can to address that physical pain. But when it comes to emotional pain, we discard it. We say it's in the past. We say it's not a big deal. We cast it aside and act as if the behaviors that we're carrying out in life are just normal, right? Now, I want to say that we're all normal, and yet we know that trauma creates abnormalities. And if we can normalize the abnormalities that trauma creates and understand that we have an opportunity to massage that thing just like we would as if we're in physical pain, then we would change the trajectory of how we talk about trauma and how we treat trauma, right? And even right now as we speak, one of the things that I discovered after I read Body Keeps the Score recently, because I've been absorbing everything I can about understanding about trauma and how it affects the body, what we heavily invest in terms of treating trauma survivors is medication and CBT. Well, medication and CBT is not going to help someone who is a complex trauma survivor who has PTSD. So you imagine that, right? The very things that we invest in so heavily, if we're talking about medication, at best, it may numb the symptomology, but it doesn't get to the root cause that helps us to regulate so that we are okay in this body, to help us to create a sense of balance in the body in parts of the system that have been shocked as a result of that trauma. And then when it comes to CBT, certainly abundance mindset and reframing can have deep implications for how we see ourselves and how we see the world. But CBT is not necessarily an abundance mindset in its totality, right? And so if we can really say, I'm going to give myself the gift of healing, and I know that there are a lot of ways that I can go about this. And there are people like myself and people like you and a cadre of others who are ready and willing to provide the psychological safety necessary to allow people to enter in so that they too can have lives that are only rooted in their wildest dreams. And in fact, something that they probably can't even conjure up yet, because we can't become what we can't see. And so my hope is that you and I will be the sight that they need to see so that they can give themselves the gift of healing just the way that we have.
Yeah, it's really interesting because you, in your interview that I watched recently, you reference Elizabeth Smart. And I was very thankful that you mentioned that documentary or story, because I too was very impacted by that, because as you mentioned in your interview, and I think it was implied in the documentary, is that oftentimes victims of trauma are seen as perpetrators, which further traumatizes someone that has been through many times horrific experiences. I wanted to ask you, because I know why it was so impactful for me to hear her story. Why was that particular story so impactful for you?
Yeah, because that's my story too, right? And it's the story of so many survivors. I'm actually getting ready to write an article about this. And it's not just, it doesn't just come from men, it comes from women too. This is a societal phenomenon that happens where we vilify victims for all kinds of reasons that's rooted in our socialization, essentially. And, you know, the thought that a 14-year-old girl could be seen as a perpetrator, can be seen as someone who had the power to entice an adult who was actually grooming her, right? Because that's what makes predators good at what they do. They groom. And, you know, most people that are, that engage in sexually traumatic acts, they are very close to home. We're talking educators. We're talking priests and pastors. We're talking babysitters, family members. And so, and part of that enticement, right, is because they have seen something wounded in us and they capitalize on that. And so that's why this is so important, because if we can really see survivors as victims, as someone that's been harmed, then we can treat them with the humanity necessary to help them to heal. Right. And luckily, the Elizabeth Smarts of the world, myself, you know, whatever your story is, Angela, and so many others, we found the strength to do what was needed to rise in spite of. Some people are not that fortunate. Some people literally will take their lives, right? They will remove themselves from the world at worst, and at best, really be a walking zombie, be at war with the world. Because if we can't settle in our bodies, and if we can't find safe in our bodies as a result of not just the trauma itself, but also how the world is now attacking us in the midst of carrying this tremendous pain, we have to find an outlet. right? And so the outlet can be substance abuse. It can be any form of addiction, because we have to find a way to get it out, even if the way to get it out is harming ourselves or harming other people.
Yeah, I can think about personal times in my own life before I started the significant journey of healing, where I knew from the outside I probably appeared to be this disturbed individual that was acting out, behaving badly. And quite honestly, I was hurting. I was in so much pain. Yeah. And there were times when I went from feeling completely numb to completely worthless to a myriad of emotions that I couldn't at different times in my life because of my youth and because of my immaturity and because of my age. I didn't even have the ability to process. And like you, I am one of those individuals that have 8 out of the 10 ACEs. And for those people that don't understand what that means, and I'll give you the opportunity to explain that for the benefit of those that are going to listen to the podcast. It wasn't until I had the opportunity to do the box check where I realized how extensive my trauma had been and even though I think there is a benefit to normalizing trauma, so there's more conversation about it, understanding that I think more of us have experienced a traumatic event than not. And some of us have experienced many more traumatic events than others. I do think that, unfortunately, until we have more conversations like you and I are having today, there are going to be many Demarras and many Angelas walking around in pain and exhibiting behaviors or doing things that will actually dim the light, that will actually cause someone to limit their potential. And that is I would say my sincere hope is that people like you and I can have an impact, can really have a significant impact on those individuals, that can shift the way people think about trauma so that more and more people can heal. And so they don't end up in the strip club or end up on the street corner or end up in the prison cell or end up in the cemetery.
Yeah. That was such a beautiful sentiment. And I have to believe that this message it's gonna resonate, right? The people that we are called to reach, we're gonna reach them. And whether it be in this episode or it be through my book or it be through other kinds of work that we do, because I believe that whatever we're seeking is seeking us. And even if we don't have an awareness of it, one of the things that has happened since I released this book that is not surprising, but every time it just blows my mind, the number of people who said, oh my gosh, like, you've helped me realize that I have a lot of healing to do myself. You helped me realize that, oh my gosh, I've lived my life for 50 years, for 60 years, for 70 years. And I have things that I have not been willing to look at because I've been afraid to. And thank you for giving me an opportunity to look at it. Oh, I'm getting so emotional right now. There are so many people who grit and bear it, who are smiling, who are doing amazing work in the world, in community, and who are deeply miserable, who are living less than, people with great incomes, who look on the surface like life is great, right? We have those people too. We have people like us who as teens, we had to get it out somehow. And that meant a lot of behavioral things, right? A lot of things that again, was at war with self, at war with the world, because we didn't know how to contain it. We didn't know what to do with it. We didn't even have the developmental capacity to access those higher level thinking skills that's necessary to be able to navigate, right? And oftentimes young people like us are alone in it too, right? And so there's no safe haven. But then you also have people who maybe didn't behave that way. And maybe they were excellent students. And maybe they kind of were under the radar some, right? Because these are learned behaviors in terms of our survival, right? We will do all kinds of things to survive. But one thing that I know for certain is there are so many people in the world who are sick as a result of their trauma that has not been healed, who are unhappy, in broken marriages, disconnected from their children, living like hermits, trying to live vicariously through other people, and who have had the inability to access sustainable joy and peace. So I want to just invite people to examine even how we believe that someone is well or not. Because what we don't get to see is what is happening on the inside of people. And if we have the sacred gift of people coming into our space to share the deepest, darkest parts of themselves, there's nothing more powerful than that. There's nothing more powerful than people saying, oh my gosh, Angela, I know that you're going to be my safe haven. And let me roll up my sleeves so that I can begin my healing journey with you, right? Because it's not easy, but staying in on healing is also not easy, right? Like both pathways are going to be hard, but the pathway of trauma recovery is actually going to be the pathway of rising. So we can either do the hard work now, or we can live in the unrest of unhealed trauma that will cause us living a life of less than, because there is no other way. And there's no way to get around it, to get under it. We've got to do the work that is required to sit with it so that then we can figure it out enough and have enough skills in our toolbox to liberate for ourselves first. How
can people get your book so that they can get some tools in their toolbox?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking that, sis. So they can get it on Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, and Ingram Spark. The book is available in hardcover, soft cover, along with the ebook version. And we are in the process of releasing a reader's guide right now as we speak as well. And that reader's guide will have, it has, I should say, 21 reflection questions to help people to really connect with the material in the ways that is most calling them. There's an inspirational journal that we've got embedded in there for some reflection along with those questions. And then other definitions and things of that nature to really help people to get more out of the book itself.
I just want to thank you so much for your purpose, your passion, for not only doing the necessary work to heal yourself, but being committed to doing the work necessary to help other people. Yeah.
Thank you. And I want to say the same to you, right? You have been my sister for a while, but, of course, knowing that you too have 8 out of 10 ACEs and going through that checklist, just like I did that day that I was doing a trauma training to heal the world. I'm like, I got my own healing to do, and just for everything that you do, from, being on the radio to hosting this podcast, to being community minded, to the individuals that you coach, to helping people to have to work through physical symptomology, right? That can be a manifestation of trauma. So I just want to thank you for also doing the work and for inviting me into the sacred space so that we can get as many people as possible to a state of healing and liberation. I appreciate you so much.
And I appreciate you. Thanks for listening to Empower It with Angela T. Moore. Feel free to share this episode with someone you think would enjoy it. New episodes come out weekly. Follow our show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you're listening right now.